Hi, everyone. I'm Sue Peshin, President and CEO of the Alliance for Aging Research. Thank you for joining us at today's webinar, Pay It Forward, Volunteering for COVID-19 Clinical Trials. We're very excited to learn about Combat COVID, which is Operation Warp Speed's new web portal for COVID-19 research studies. For those of you who don't know us, the Alliance for Aging Research is the leading nonprofit organization dedicated to accelerating science to improve the experience of aging and health. And please check us out after the webinar at agingresearch.org. We've worked with a lot of you who have joined us today, and we're very glad that you're here. We have a wide variety of organizations that are represented today, including state units and area agencies on aging, family caregiver advocacy groups, public health departments, companies working in the vaccine space, patient and provider groups, and even members of the media, who are all here to learn how we can work together to make sure COVID-19 clinical trials get the volunteers they need. Next slide, please. We have an incredible list of speakers today. Our first speaker will be Dr. Anthony Fauci, Director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the NIH. Dr. Fauci will speak about current areas of research focus in COVID-19 prevention and treatment and why older adult participation is so important. Next, we have Dr. Janet Woodcock, Director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. Dr. Woodcock is currently serving an important detail as the therapeutic lead at Operation Warp Speed, and it's in that capacity that she's here with us today. Our next speaker is Lance Robertson, Administrator of the Administration for Community Living and Assistant Secretary for Aging at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and he'll share insights from the Aging Services Network about some of the challenges to increasing the numbers of older adults who participate in clinical trials. And our final speaker is the Alliance Vice President of Health Education and Advocacy, Lindsay Clarke. Lindsay will speak to you today about effective messaging and educational tools for explaining clinical trials and encouraging participation. After they've each had a chance to speak, I'll ask a couple of questions. But to submit a question anytime during the webinar, please utilize the chat feature. We're going to answer questions during the Q&A segment, which will be held after the conclusion of the presentations. Next slide, please. Our first speaker was not able to be with us in person today, but he kindly recorded remarks just before the webinar, providing an informative overview of the state of the science on COVID-19. As I think everybody here knows, Dr. Anthony Fauci serves as one of the nation's top infectious disease experts, and he's been a steady and reassuring voice throughout the pandemic. Let's take a few minutes to watch his video.
I'd like to take this opportunity for thanking the organizers of the Alliance for Aging Research for giving me the opportunity to make this presentation today. You can see from this first slide, I'm going to talk to you briefly today about an update on the pandemic of COVID-19. Before I actually get into it, I want to show this slide, which is a slide of the cover of the Journal of the American Medical Association, in which my colleagues and I wrote a viewpoint, which I chose to entitle Coronavirus Infections More Than Just the Common Cold. And I chose this title not to be facetious, but to point out to the readers of the viewpoint that we have had experience now with coronaviruses for several decades. And what I'm referring to is if you look at this phylogenetic tree of the coronaviruses, the human coronaviruses are in red lettering. Bats and other intermediate hosts are also important reservoirs of similar coronaviruses. But I want to point out the 4 coronaviruses that are highlighted in yellow. They represent the coronaviruses that are responsible for anywhere between 15 and 30% of all the recurrent common colds that we get repetitively each year, usually during the winter months. That we had known for decades and decades. But then in 2002, we had the first pandemic coronavirus, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, which began in Guangdong, China, went from a bat to a civet cat to a human, infected 8,000 people with almost 800 deaths. It was controlled completely by public health measures and essentially disappeared. 10 years later, in 2012, again, an animal jump from a bat to a camel to a human led to the Middle East respiratory syndrome beginning in Saudi Arabia. It, in fact, is still smoldering today, although it does have pandemic potential. Fast forward now to what we're having and experiencing at the present time is the third coronavirus that is a pandemic, and that is COVID-19, standing for coronavirus disease 19, is a disease, and the virus that causes it is SARS coronavirus 2. Fast forward globally, where we are today, 48 million cases and over 1.2 million deaths worldwide, which makes it the most important and devastating respiratory disease pandemic in the last 102 years since the 1918 Spanish flu. Unfortunately for us in the United States, we have been hit worse than any other country in the world, with now close to 10 million cases and over 230,000 deaths. The relative representation of cases is shown by the darkened colors in the various states on this slide. Quickly looking at the virology, as I showed on a prior slide, this is a RNA beta coronavirus. It has multiple structural genes, including the S protein and its receptor binding domain, which is important in binding to the ACE2 receptor, which is distributed throughout the body, particularly the upper and lower respiratory tract, the GI tract, and other organs. With regard to the transmission, this is a respiratory-borne virus transmitted through droplets, some of which are large enough to fall to the ground within a few feet, and others are what we call aerosol. They're light enough to be able to float in the air over time and distances for anywhere from seconds to several minutes or more. The virus is found in stool, blood, semen, and other body secretions, but its role in transmission is unknown and likely not important. Importantly, this infection is very unique. In about 40 to 45% of the infections are asymptomatic. In other words, people do not know that they are infected due to any symptoms. If you look at the clinical presentation, it resembles very much early on a flu-like syndrome, as shown on this slide. However, there is a degree of uniqueness in that some individuals have a curious loss of smell and taste, which precedes the onset of respiratory symptoms. In addition to the 40 to 45% of people who have no symptoms, those who do, about 80% have mild to moderate symptoms, where about 15 to 20% have either severe or critical amount of symptoms. And that is predominantly respiratory and others. The case fatality rate varies from a few percent to up to 20 to 25% in people who require mechanical ventilation. The severe manifestations, as I alluded to a moment ago, predominantly the acute respiratory distress syndrome. However, other organ systems, such as the heart, the neurological system, the kidney, can all be damaged. There is a curious hypercoagulability state in some individuals with microthrombi in small vessels, and even some with thromboembolic phenomenon causing acute stroke in otherwise healthy individuals. In addition, there's a multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children resembling Kawasaki syndrome. Some individuals, varying percentage, 20, 25, and up to 30%, who recover virologically from the infection have persistence over weeks to months or longer of symptoms that are comprised of fatigue, shortness of breath, body aches, temperature abnormalities, and what some refer to as brain fog, or an inability to concentrate or focus intellectually or mentally. People who are at increased risk for the severe manifestations of COVID-19 are older individuals and people of any age with certain medical conditions. These are some of those underlying medical conditions which push people at increased risk for severe COVID illness. Paramount among these are obesity, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, and the others shown on this slide. There are other conditions that may confer an increased risk for severe COVID illness. They're shown on this slide. I want to point out a few in particular: hypertension, diabetes, and cerebrovascular disease. With regard to therapeutics, the National Institutes of Health has put together an expert panel of a treatment guidelines committee, which have produced a living document online that's consistently and constantly being updated in real time with clinical data to help clinicians care for and treat people with COVID-19. This guideline can be accessed easily online at COVID-19 treatment guidelines.nih.gov. The therapeutics or treatments, 2 of these have been proven in a randomized placebo-controlled trial to improve the condition of COVID-19. Remdesivir, an antiviral agent, showed in hospitalized patients requiring oxygen with lung disease a diminution in the time to recovery, whereas dexamethasone, a commonly used steroid, has shown in a randomized placebo-controlled trial a significant diminution in mortality of people who are hospitalized and require either mechanical ventilation or high-flow oxygen. On the bottom part of the slide are examples of other investigational therapies that are being tested, have shown some promise but not proven yet, such as direct antivirals, blood-derived products such as convalescent plasma, hyperimmune globulin. Cautiously optimistic about monoclonal antibodies. They show some promise in early studies, as well as a number of immune modulators. And finally, vaccines. We have taken a strategic approach to COVID-19 vaccine research and development. By that, I mean that we have, the United States government, have been supporting with a number of important resources, at least 6 candidates for vaccines. 5 of them are already in advanced clinical trials. And the strategic approach has been a harmonization among the trials with a common data and safety monitoring board, common primary and secondary endpoints, and common immunological parameters to follow. These are an example of those platforms that are being shown and developed by the companies listed on the slide. There's nucleic acid, mRNA, by Moderna and Pfizer. There are viral vectors such as adenovirus and VSV by AstraZeneca, Janssen, and Merck. And there are protein subunits by Novavax and Sanofi. As mentioned, 5 of these are in phase 3 trial, 2 of which began on July 27th. They are fully enrolled, and we should be expecting evidence of efficacy and safety. This is something that we hope we see. We feel reasonably, I would say, cautiously optimistic that we are going to get a positive result because of the preliminary data that look good. But we will not know for sure until likely the end of November, the beginning of December. If we have these successful vaccines, we'll be able to implement them by the end of this year and the beginning of the coming year. I want to make a point, as shown on this slide, that we do have an issue that we need to address of a reluctance on the part of certain individuals, particularly those in the minority communities, about getting a vaccine. We need to reach out to them, embrace them, and get them to understand the importance for themselves and for their community to get vaccinated once a safe and effective vaccine becomes available. And finally, for those of you who want to learn more about this prevention approach, particularly with vaccines, there's the COVID-19 Prevention Network you can access online at www.preventcovid.org. You can find out what you would like to know about these trials, and you can even indicate your willingness to at least consider being a volunteer for one of these trials. Thank you very much.
So although Dr. Fauci couldn't be with us here today, we're grateful for his involvement and his continued leadership. Our next speaker is someone the Alliance has greatly appreciated for her exceptional leadership as Director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. and her longstanding commitment to bringing safe, effective, and innovative drugs to the American people. We're thrilled that Dr. Woodcock is currently leading the Therapeutics effort in the fight against COVID-19 for Operation Warp Speed, and she's going to share an update with us now.
The Alliance is sponsoring this webinar because I think recent events show just how important reaching our older population is actually going to be. I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to talk to you about Combat COVID, which is going to be a website coming up that will enable people to find all U.S. government-sponsored trials in COVID, despite whether they're sick, whether they're healthy, whether they've recovered. There are different trials people can be put into or volunteer for that can help us fight this disease and gaining knowledge and understanding that we need. And then right after that, I want to talk about the recent emergency use authorization that was put forth by the FDA yesterday for a monoclonal antibody by Eli Lilly, and because it's targeted to a great extent to the older population. And I think we really need to get the word out. So first, if I could have the next slide, let's talk about Combat COVID. We'll be putting up a website that should provide relevant information for everyone. Everybody who, whether they have COVID or not, and they know somebody, someone in their family is sick or they're worried about them, and also for healthcare providers. And what this shows, as you see the screenshot here, is that it tries to bring everybody in and talk about what they can do to help join the fight. You know, we've told people to stay home. People often feel they don't have any agency, and there's not that much they can do to actually contribute to the fight against this disease, but everyone can contribute by joining a trial. So you see on the right here, I've never had COVID. I could join a prevention trial, and that's the link that Dr. Fauci was talking about. I have COVID. Find a treatment trial so people can locate trials where they could get into. I recovered from COVID. Well, you can donate plasma, and even after you're discharged from the hospital, sometimes you can actually be in a trial to see if we can help you recover better. Or I'm a doctor, and this would help provide physicians understand all the options for government-sponsored trials. And many of these are sponsored by Operation Warp Speed in collaboration with the National Institutes of Health and the active public-private partnership that NIH has stood up. Next slide, please. So for people who never had COVID, they can both get information on what causes COVID so that they can sort of understand what kind of risk that they're in and so forth. But then how can I participate in a clinical trial for a new vaccine? And we may be having other kind of preventive trials going on as well. In fact, even if we get a very good, very successful vaccines, we may still have people who don't want to take a vaccine or don't respond to a vaccine. And they can enter into trials of other kind of prophylactic agents that are not vaccines. So this slide explains to people how the clinical trials work, how they can help us, and how a person can volunteer into a prevention trial and help, say, get a vaccine rushed to the public, as rapidly as possible by their own participation. We go to the next slide. But if people click on I've recovered from COVID-19, we have had a huge program that has been sponsored by the government to give people who are in the hospital with COVID-19 and are ill convalescent plasma. And this is information on how to help others recover as you have recovered by donating your own plasma and can go to those web pages. we've had tremendous response from the public. And this amazes me, really, the altruism out there. We've had people who've been terribly sick and have suffered, and yet they have, as they're recovering and trying to get their strength back, because we need to get that plasma soon after they've recovered, they've pulled themselves together and gotten to the blood centers and donated their own plasma to help other people. And I think it's a really inspiring story about Americans, and this hopefully will help us reach more people. Next slide. So for physicians, not all physicians know about all the options for trials, and they are an important source of referring patients to clinical trials. So this is information for doctors to help them talk to patients about the clinical trials and also about donating plasma and having all that information available. And it also links to the NIH treatment guidelines, too, to remind people of what we know right now and what we have recommended and what we don't know. Next slide, please. And then I have COVID. All right, there are more and more government trials going on for every stage of this disease, including people who are outpatients, people who have not very bad disease, to people who are inpatients, to people who are very sick inpatients, to those who have actually left the hospital and are trying to recover but may be at risk for some of the kind of complications Dr. Fauci was talking about, such as thrombotic blood clot problems. There are clinical trials for these things. So we are very interested in, for people who have COVID, to get them that information. These would link people to a call center or website that would help them navigate through, find out what trials were actually near enough to them that they could participate in, and be able to explain the trials to them and so forth, the eligibility criteria, so we don't waste their time. So all of these links would help link to people who could talk to patients if they were interested. Next slide. And so this really is about ACTIVE. ACTIVE is, as I said, the public-private partnership that is put together. It's sponsored by the Foundation for NIH, but it's between NIH and many biotechnology and drug companies and many other parties such as DOD and VA and so forth. We've all come together to try and put together platform trials to test as many possible interventions as possible in a rigorous fashion. And so if you can call NIH, you can learn more, you can call this toll-free number at the bottom, and that can help you figure out the different sites, what's near you, whether you're eligible for a trial or not, and there would be people to walk patients through this. So we hope this whole package, when it goes live, hopefully next week or so, that it will really help bring people into the clinical trials, because of course we're also experiencing a great wave of disease in the country, and this we really need to find effective therapies and preventives as rapidly as possible. Next slide. So this goes through all the different trials. People who are detail-oriented, patients and others, will want to look at this in great detail. Other people will just probably, this will glaze their eyes over, but everybody can call the toll-free number and get walked through, because it's also very important to know what sites are near you and do you have an opportunity to join, what trials do you actually realistically have an opportunity to participate in. But these are 5 of the active trials, and Active 4 actually has 3 trials. So this is quite a few trials that are going on in a whole range of people, including outpatients, discharged patients, and hospitalized patients. Next slide. So now I'd like to turn to talking about the emergency use authorization that was announced yesterday and that we're putting more information out today. This is a result of a clinical trial, in fact, of a number of clinical trials that have been done that have actually demonstrated in people who are outpatients who have COVID, who have mild to moderate disease, that it's likely that giving them an IV infusion of this monoclonal antibody could decrease the virus in their blood and in their nasal areas, drop the virus down, and also decrease hospitalization. So in other words, slow down or stop the progression of the illness early. This emergency use authorization says that people 65 or over, because they are high risk, and should all be eligible for this intervention as outpatients. So they have mild to moderate disease, they're diagnosed as having COVID by test, and they're less than 10 days from starting their symptoms, because this type of intervention will work best when it's given early. And this drug, as I speak, is being shipped around the country to hospitals, all right, to begin to make it available. It's very important for people to get the word out, however, because we've told all the outpatients that unless they're very sick and they need to be in the hospital, they should stay home. And the older people who are at most risk for hospitalization may not really think that they are now eligible for treatment that might really change their risk. So the other challenge that we have is, of course, the healthcare system may not quite be ready for giving IV infusions to infected outpatients, and we're going to have to build up the capacity very rapidly over the next few weeks to be giving this to people, but also the public needs to be aware, especially the older public, that we can probably modify the risk by giving them this therapy if, in fact, they become infected and have symptoms. So I think that's very good news, but part of it is because American patients volunteered to be in clinical trials that actually showed that this therapy can be beneficial. And that's why we're asking everybody to participate, that they can fight this, that we can get through this. And this web site that we're launching, I think, should help provide that information, and we hope everyone will help us get the word out. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Woodcock. Just a reminder to our attendees today, you can enter any questions that you have into the webinar chat function, and we're going to open it up to questions later in the program. But first, I want to turn things over to Lance Robertson, who serves as the administrator of HHS's Administration for Community Living and also serves as the Assistant Secretary for Aging. The administrator's vision for ACL focuses on 5 pillars: supporting families and caregivers, protecting rights and preventing abuse, connecting people to resources, expanding employment opportunities, and strengthening the aging and disability networks. Assistant Secretary, thank you so much for being with us, and please take it away.
All right, thank you, Sue. It's always an honor to participate in Alliance for Aging Research events, because I know how dedicated you and your staff are to supporting the well-being and independence of older Americans. And I appreciate the opportunity to share with your viewers some information about some of the work here at ACL that we are doing toward that same shared goal. For those in our audience who are a little less familiar with the Administration for Community Living, or ACL for short, let me provide you just a little bit of background. ACL is an operating division in the Department of Health and Human Services like FDA, NIH, CMS, CDC. Our mission, as our name of course suggests, centers on community living, and specifically how we can help make it possible for older adults and people with disabilities to live independently in the community. At ACL, we start from the position that everyone has the right to determine for themselves where and how they live their lives. The overwhelming majority of older Americans and people with disabilities strongly prefer to live in their own home, not in a facility. As part of our mission, we fund a number of service streams, including research, education, and innovation to make community living possible for more people. We're also unique among federal agencies in that, by law, we are tasked to be a federal advocate for older adults and people with disabilities. A big area of focus for us is connecting people to available resources and ensuring that they can make informed decisions about what services will best meet their needs. During this time of year, our networks are hard at work encouraging older adults to get their flu vaccines, as one example. And this is also a time of year when ACL's State Health Insurance Assistance Programs, or SHIP for short, they're all busy helping people with Medicare open enrollment season. SHIP counselors, and there are about 15,000 of them, provide local, in-depth, and objective one-on-one assistance and outreach to Medicare beneficiaries, their families, and caregivers. And another ACL program is the Elder Care Locator, which is both a website and a toll-free number that's staffed with experts ready to help older adults find the services they need. But the biggest part of our mission is funding services that make it possible for people to live independently. The majority of those services are provided through America's Aging and Disability Network, which includes more than 20,000 community-based organizations spread all across the country. These organizations are the backbone of America's social services for older adults and people with disabilities. They deliver meals, battle social isolation, support people in achieving employment goals, and provide services in the homes and communities that improve the health and well-being of older adults and people with disabilities all across the country. In other words, the Aging and Disability Network have the unparalleled ability to reach older adults and people with disabilities. And that means they're in a good position to help connect older adults and people with disabilities to information about vaccine trials, plasma donation opportunities, and vaccinations when we have vaccines broadly available. And it's important to remember that many of the people served by the Aging and Disability Networks are, of course, disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And they'll be the people who will benefit the most from the efforts of Operation Warp Speed. Beyond the direct impact of COVID-19, older adults and people with disabilities have also seen some of the services they require put under stress during the pandemic emergency. Services such as those offered through senior centers across the country, which now have been offered through delivery services or via virtual platforms. No one wants to see things return to normal more than the people we serve, and they fully understand the need for vaccine trials. As we encourage participation in the trials by all segments of the population, I have to say that it's equally important to understand the concerns that older adults and people who have underlying health conditions may have about participating, and the concerns that the Aging and Disability Networks might have about encouraging participation. But the best thing we can do is just provide honest, straightforward information that is easy to understand about the trials, the risks, and what is being done to mitigate them. Older Americans and people with disabilities have a right to know about the Combat COVID website. They have the right to determine for themselves whether or not they want to participate in a trial. They have the right to know how important it is to make sure any and all COVID-19 vaccines and treatments have been adequately tested in the groups that need them the most. Trust means everything. Trust in vaccines has historically been facilitated by the incredibly positive impact that vaccines have had on public health and reducing illness and death over the past century. In the middle of a global pandemic, it is a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine that will help bring life back to normal. And it's in everyone's best interest to have multiple vaccines in development. That gives us the best chance at vaccines that meet the unique needs of older adults. But that can't happen if we don't have enough people participating in research. And that is the message we know we need help spread. We won't pressure anyone into making a decision. We just want to make sure that everyone has the information they need to make their own informed choice. So let me close by thanking everyone listening today who have been hard at work keeping America safe and healthy. I have no doubt that Operation Warp Speed will one day be seen as the effort most responsible for creating a path for improved health and well-being of older Americans and people with disabilities during this crisis. For our part, ACL has added to the list of priorities making sure that the Aging and Disability Networks and the people we all serve are aware of the reasons why it is so important for all segments of society to be represented at vaccine trials and are aware of where they can go to find the information they need. And I want to encourage the Aging and Disability Networks to do the same. America has a long history of pulling together in a crisis. Our nation's older adults have a long history of paying it forward and taking individual action to benefit the greater good. I think they also understand the importance of being represented in the clinical trials. Our mission then is to, again, provide them with the information they need to make informed decisions. And that is what ACL will do as we help older adults and people with disabilities learn more about the Combat COVID website. Thank you so much, Sue. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Robertson. That was excellent. We're really grateful for the work you and your team are doing at ACL, advocating on behalf of older Americans and the disability community. Before I introduce our last speaker, a couple people have asked about the website. It's hhs.gov/combatcovid, and we'll show it again towards the end. It's not going to go live until closer to the end of November, but we'll let you know as soon as it does. Please just make a note of it and, be ready when you do your outreach. So our last speaker for today is the Alliance's Lindsay Clarke, Vice President of Health Education and Advocacy. Lindsay is a nationally recognized expert in older adult health education and advocacy. For more than 15 years, Lindsay has created award-winning, high-impact educational materials to improve the health and well-being of older adults and their family caregivers, including our Pay It Forward campaign on volunteering for clinical trials, which you're going to hear about now.
I'm honored to be included in this esteemed panel and to get a chance to talk with all of you about encouraging older adults to participate in clinical trials. Next slide. It's important as we talk about this to remember that clinical trial enrollment has always been challenging. According to a study by the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, as you can see here, 37% of all studies don't enroll enough patients of any age, and 11% fail to enroll any patients. Despite important policy changes at the National Institutes of Health that encourage older adult participation in studies, older adult enrollment is still low. And a report that was just released yesterday by the FDA showed that between 2015 and 2019, 31% of participants were 65 or older. Not surprisingly, enrollment in all clinical trials plummeted at the beginning of the pandemic, and many clinical trials were put on hold. While participation is starting to bounce back, we need to keep in mind that it was low to start with. Next slide. We clearly need volunteers if we're going to be able to get COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics to the public. And we need many of those volunteers to be older adults. As Assistant Secretary Robertson mentioned, older adults have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, and 8 in 10 deaths have been in people over the age of 65. Additionally, we not only need to protect those that are most vulnerable, but we also need to know how the vaccine will work in the bodies of older adults. The body of a 70-year-old will likely respond differently than the body of a 50-year-old to a vaccine. But without that data, we don't know how the response will be different. Immunosenescence is the gradual weakening of the immune system with age, and combined with increases in low-grade inflammation and higher likelihood of diseases that compromise the immune system, older adults often have diminished responses to vaccines. So we need to know that the vaccine will trigger an adequate immune response in older adults and offer them protection. We need all clinical trials, in fact, to give the full picture of the risks and the benefits for all the patients who are going to use that product if approved. But how do we get those volunteers? Next slide, please. So that same survey from Tufts that I just referenced found that 40% of adults don't understand clinical trials. But once they do understand, 32% say they'd consider participating. This means we need to start with raising awareness about clinical trials in general, their importance, and their potential benefits. Next slide. So there are many great resources out there to help folks understand clinical trials. A plug for our film that Sue mentioned, Pay It Forward. It's a pocket film that you can find on our website at agingresearch.org/payitforward. It's designed to be shared, so it's used by any of you who want to spread the word and raise awareness about clinical trials and their importance. And you can also download it off of our Vimeo channel. The National Institute on Aging at NIH has a great Q&A section that answers a lot of common questions about clinical trials. And then, as Dr. Woodcock mentioned, Combat COVID will have some important resources that talk about clinical trials and answer some common questions. So in addition to raising awareness about how clinical trials work generally, we should also educate about the benefits of participation. First of all, volunteering can contribute to research that helps society at large. It can bring new treatments just one step closer to reaching patients and potentially leading to future discoveries and breakthroughs. For COVID trials, we really need to appeal to the role volunteers can play in ending this pandemic. Our lives have been turned upside down, and we're all waiting for the moment when we can send our kids back to school, travel, go back to work, hug our loved ones. But we can't do it without a vaccine and treatments, and we can't develop those without volunteers. While this is not as relevant with COVID trials, it is important with all clinical trials to remember with general clinical trials that a large portion of diseases are genetic, so contributions can help future generations. Next slide. We really need to share with people that volunteering can give them access to experimental cutting-edge treatment options, and oftentimes it's the medical research team that carefully monitors they always carefully monitor their disease and overall health, and in some cases that treatment is more comprehensive than if they weren't enrolled in the trial. In the case of COVID, volunteers can potentially receive the vaccine before the rest of the public. Next slide. There's also barriers we need to address. Potential volunteers have always had concerns about side effects and adverse events. While trials must disclose all these risks and are designed to answer those questions, we need to consider answering those questions as people are considering volunteering. We can emphasize that some trials simply monitor health and disease, some arms of trials continue with standard of care, and when we are testing a new innovation, participants are closely monitored for any potential side effects and adverse events. Understandably, during the pandemic, participation has gone down since many of us have been staying home to stay safe. We've seen a decline in medical care across the board, from regular medical care for annual visits to emergency care for chest pain. So we need to be sure to reassure volunteers that trials have been redesigned to keep patients as safe as possible, and that wearing a mask, social distancing, and frequent hand washing do a lot to help keep them safe. We also need to address the fear of the process that has unfortunately grown during this time. Distrust of the speed and review of the vaccine has led to distrust of vaccines itself. The Food and Drug Administration has been open and transparent about the process they'll follow to help make sure that COVID vaccines are safe and effective. The FDA career scientists uphold globally respected standards for product quality, safety, and efficacy, and they monitor the entire process from development to once it's out and available to the public. So we need to be communicating how these vaccines are being developed rapidly. And there's an infographic here from the Adult Vaccine Access Coalition that we're a member of that shows this accelerated process. And one of the things that seems to really resonate with folks is understanding that part of the reason this can go faster is that the manufacturers are manufacturing the vaccine oftentimes at the same time that they are developing. So they're really just cutting down on some of that process, but it is not in any way sacrificing safety or efficacy. Next slide. So in general, some other potential barriers for participation that we need to consider is concerns about cost. Many people believe that clinical trials are expensive to the individual, when in fact participation and costs of extra care are typically covered, along with travel and lost wages. Sometimes volunteers are even paid for their participation. People often believe they can only join a clinical trial when they're out of treatment options, and it's their only hope. Many trials do enroll healthy patients or patients with other treatment options, and even those who won't receive a treatment but will provide data on the standard of care. Many people are really worried about not being able to see their primary care physician to receive care elsewhere, and while they will need to go to other providers for clinical trial, for their care, they can continue to see their PCP for their regular care. Some people are worried about the information being shared, so it's important to emphasize that it's always anonymous. And then some patients may have disabilities or transportation difficulties that make participation cumbersome or even impossible. So there are often services affiliated with the trial or the trial site that can help them with access. Last slide. So many of you may have heard of the concept of generativity. It was coined by psychologist Erik Erikson and refers to concern for the future, a need to nurture and guide younger people and contribute to the next generation. Dr. Erikson taught that in terms of psychosocial development, this usually develops during middle age, and I think it's fitting for today's discussion. Getting medical discoveries from the research lab to patients depends on clinical trials and the people that volunteer to participate in them. Volunteering in a trial helps society at large and future generations by bringing prevention options such as vaccines, as well as new treatments one step closer to all those who need it. So right now, scientists working in the fight against COVID-19 need as many volunteers as possible to help us get back to normal. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. That was great. We're getting a lot of questions in, so I'm trying to pick and choose here. I'm going to actually ask Dr. Woodcock a question first. I think people are curious, given the announcement yesterday about the vaccine, is whether or not people are just going to want that, and is that going to be available to everyone? And then I think people are also asking questions about how these both the vaccines and the treatments are going to be paid for, if they're going to have to pay for them or not.
Can you hear me, Sue?
Yes.
So, okay, get the payment question off the table. Operation Warp Speed has purchased these agents, and so we would expect costs of the drug, at least for this emergency use authorization for Lilly, the cost of the drug may be will be free. All right, there isn't a cost. The administration has costs. Typically, they can be billed to insurance, and we're working with CMS on making sure that all those costs, to the extent legal, can be covered, so that people can get this. But other insurance and the uninsured should be able to have it covered through the funds that have been already allocated for those purposes. Who is eligible for this, and what should they get the EUA drug or be in a trial? All right, the EUA drug is only for outpatients. So if people are already hospitalized for COVID, they wouldn't be in this. Wouldn't be getting this monoclonal antibody, okay, outside of a trial. And it's not for people who are well, all right? So it's not a preventive. So it's for people with mild to moderate symptoms of COVID, and particularly though everybody 65 and over, and people under 65 if they have certain risk factors. And that's all listed, on the website, and it should be widely available what those criteria are. But for older people with mild, moderate symptoms, and they've been diagnosed with COVID, to make sure they're less than 10 days from having their symptom onset, that's the window where they could get this drug through the emergency use authorization to try and shorten their symptoms and decrease their probability of having serious disease and having to be hospitalized, okay? Now, there may be trials still going on with outpatients, and if there are, some of those you may be able to do both. For example, if they're studying an anticoagulant, if another monoclonal antibody or some other type of intervention is being studied, then patients will probably have a choice of going into the trial or trying to pursue the emergency use authorization. And that would all be explained to the patient, so people would be very transparent. All right. Some of it may be, can you have access to the emergency use authorization infusion, that monoclonal antibody? Do you have access to that? Do you have access to a trial site? And you can get in a trial or whatever. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, and I just wanted to follow up just for clarification in terms of the availability of the vaccines. There's more than just one vaccine and more than one trial going on. So for people who might be worried there won't be enough, what do you say to them?
Well, I say that the U.S. government has contracted for a very large amount of vaccines, but they won't all come at once, like this month, right? And what has to happen first is each vaccine has to complete its trial to the point where it can be found to be safe and effective, or at least meriting an emergency use authorization by the FDA before, in fact, that vaccine would be used outside of a trial. But when that happens, there's been a lot of conversation going on about who should be vaccinated first. And of course, I think the conclusion would be healthcare workers and high-risk individuals again. But you wouldn't be vaccinated if you already had COVID, all right? So these are different things. So the people who haven't been exposed, don't think they've had COVID yet, who are older or in one of those categories would probably be the first, the high-risk categories would be the first to get the vaccines as they rolled out. Because it isn't just the supply of the vaccines, it's the fact that you're going to have to give all these tens of millions of people shots, right? And these early vaccines have 2 doses, some weeks apart. So you have to get people in and then get them back in. So there will be logistical challenges. And yes, the vaccines may be somewhat limited in the first few months, but the U.S. government has the rights to purchase a very large number of vaccines over the coming months, should they prove effective.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. I just want to remind folks, as we've been getting questions about the websites, the one that Dr. Woodcock mentioned that's focused on prevention, so the vaccine trials, and for those folks who haven't yet had COVID, preventcovid.org, that is currently up and running. That's going to be integrated into the larger website, hhs.gov/combatcovid, and that will go live within the next couple of weeks. So please mark both down. Now I have a follow-up question for Lance, because this is, I think, a really important issue, and it seems like the aging network is going to be important for this. So looking ahead to when a vaccine is available, what do you think the role of the aging network, services network is in getting older adults and people with disabilities vaccinated as quickly as possible?
Sue, and certainly I agree with you. I think that our network will prove to be an indispensable part of the equation. The great news is, of course, our network, as it has done now for decades, stands ready. We, I would say, really offer 3 key things. 1, reach. 2, we're a trusted source. And then 3rd, this really is a nice work alignment for us. So, in terms of reach, as most, all of you probably know, we're in every community. And our network touches at the most grassroots level and has targeting provisions, which I think really make it the easiest to get the word out. We are a trusted source. We have that history, local level knowledge, and then, of course, offer objective information, which will be important when it comes to vaccine conversations. And finally, work alignment. We do everything each and every day to help save lives, reduce hospitalizations, help people stay in the community. Again, that's no different whether we're talking about a vaccination or any other of the many, many other support services that we offer. So, I do think that through the mechanisms of communication that we have, the reach that we have, that our network will really prove to be very, very helpful. We've been preaching that message from day 1 here within HHS. And, of course, ACL has that opportunity. We're part of all the leadership conversations and making sure that from Secretary Azar on down, people can appreciate what our network offers relative to the importance of what we're now discussing.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Woodcock, I just wanted a follow-up question because I caught this as well, and just to clarify for our listeners, I think I knew what you meant, but just so everybody makes sure they know what you meant. There was a comment about if you had COVID, you can't get the vaccine, and I think what you mean is if you have COVID, you couldn't participate in the vaccine trial. Is that what you were referring to?
I meant right now, if you're actively infected. Okay, if you're suffering from COVID, you need a treatment, not a vaccine. Okay, I'm sorry if that was confusing.
That's okay. That's great.
If you're a person who's just got COVID and you have symptoms already, you have a lot of antigen in your body. You don't need a vaccine. You need a treatment.
Great. Okay, that's good to clarify. I'm going to ask a question to Lindsay. So flu season started, and we know flu and pneumonia can complicate COVID-19. So what messages should organizations be including on annual flu shots to older adults and people with disabilities, along with the information about how to volunteer for a clinical trial on the Combat COVID website?
As the concerns, not just about someone who's infected with both at the same time, but experts are really concerned about hospitals having to deal with surges of COVID at the same time we're dealing with flu season. So people really need to get their regular vaccinations, and it's not too late to get your flu shot or your pneumonia shot if you haven't already, and if you still need to. Obviously, people are foregoing healthcare, trying to stay home and stay safe, but it's easy to go out to your local pharmacy or your supermarket or to your healthcare provider to get that vaccine. And whoever's administering, make sure you have folks talking to them about the best vaccines for them. For flu, there are high-dose and adjuvanted flu vaccines that help boost the immune response in older adults that they may need to consider getting. So be sure to talk with their healthcare professionals. And also, if they have questions about the recommended vaccines or how they work, they can visit agingresearch.org/ourbestshot.
Okay, great. Dr. Woodcock, last question. A main concern we've heard from the public on vaccine development is whether the process has been too fast and if that will impact safety and effectiveness. Please respond to that.
Sure. You know, what's been, quote, fast is manufacturers usually wait a long time before what we call scaling up production, because production is extremely expensive. And so what we've done, the government has actually provided financial support for the companies to start making large-scale supplies at a time when we don't know whether the vaccine is going to be successful or not. But all these trials, you heard what Dr. Fauci said, they all agreed on sort of a common design. They have 30,000 people in each trial. So this isn't a small cutting corners kind of effort, okay? And they're going to follow the people. They vaccinated them months ago. They're going to follow them after vaccination long enough to rule out or have a pretty good idea if there are any serious immunologic, say, side effects from the vaccination or other unanticipated problems. So that's the safety side. So they have 15,000 people that have gotten the vaccine in each one of these trials. And then on efficacy, they've published the rules. And we heard what Pfizer announced, that they, at least preliminarily, at their first look, they've had a tremendous preliminary effectiveness where more than 90% of people were protected. I mean, it's hard to argue with that, right? But yeah. What I think we can say is whatever the data are, they're going to be open, they're going to be transparent, everybody's going to have a chance to see them. And in part, there's no shortcuts whatsoever. But the manufacturing has been started long ago. And if one of these vaccines doesn't work, they'll all have to be thrown out. But that was money well spent because we didn't want to do these trials and then our hands were empty. We had no vaccine to give people, and we knew it worked. So you had to invest money early, even though knowing you were risking spending money and then having a failure. But they have enough vaccines of supporting that hopefully at least some of them are going to be successful. So that's how this works.
That's really reassuring, I think. So great. We are coming to the end of our time. If you have, additional questions, please send us an email, info@agingresearch.org. We'll try to answer the rest of the questions if we can, maybe post them along with the recording. Right now, I want to thank Dr. Woodcock, Assistant Secretary Robertson, and Lindsay for your awesome presentations and for being with us today. Dr. Fauci, you rock. All of you guys do. Thank you so much. A recording is going to be available very soon on our website. We're also going to be sending it out through email. So please share it with those who weren't able to join us today. For more information, visit us at agingresearch.org. And again, if you have questions, info@agingresearch.org. The hhs.gov/combatcovid website will go live later this month. Again, please make a note of it for your outreach. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.